And joining me now from Capitol Hill's NBC News' Ryan Nobles. NBC's Vaughn Hillyard is covering the Trump transition from West Palm Beach, Florida. And with me on set, it's NBC News chief political analyst Chuck Todd. So thank you all for being here. Ryan, is the House Ethics Committee meeting over? Do we know also about the report, what the committee is saying, and what actually maybe even is done at this point?
Yeah, so there's a lot we don't yet know, Yamiche. We know that at this point they are not going to release the report publicly. Michael Gaetz, the chairman of that committee, saying as he was leaving that there was no agreement to do so, but then he did say that there could perhaps be some avenue for the House Ethics Committee to share some of their findings with the Senate Judiciary Committee, who's handling the confirmation process of Matt Gaetz, but did not get into the specificity around that. What we're waiting to see is how Democrats on this Ethics Committee responded to this back and forth. And we are expecting the ranking member of the Ethics Committee, Susan Wild, to speak here in the next few minutes. We're monitoring that. That could happen at any moment. And see if, for instance, that the Democrats on the panel very much wanted to see that report be released publicly, but it was Republicans that rebuked them. Now, that's important, because if all of the House Democrats said yes, they wanted the report to be revealed, and it's not coming out, that would mean that every single Republican said that they wanted to keep it under wraps, because that is a committee that is made up of equal parts of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. So as you heard from the Senate Republicans that are going to be tasked with this confirmation process, they believe that they'll get this information in some form or fashion, even if it's not the House Ethics Committee report specifically, whether it's through an FBI background check, whether it's through their own investigation. But right now, it appears that that House Ethics Committee, at least for now, is not going to see the light of day, Yamiche.
Well, it's interesting, as you're talking about sort of whether or not this report is ever going to see the light of day. There are Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee, as we said, sending this letter to the FBI. So how much do we know about how ready and willing Democrats are to have this fight over Matt Gaetz?
So I think the Democrats want to get all the information out there, but they also are being very careful not to turn Matt Gaetz into some sort of MAGA martyr who will then get this support rallied around him because it appears that Democrats are out to get him. They've seen this playbook used before by Republicans, the best example being during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation, which is interesting, that sound you played earlier from Lindsey Graham, where he described the lynch mob mentality. That's what he used to describe the Brett Kavanaugh situation, and he became one of Brett Kavanaugh's biggest defenders here on Capitol Hill. They want Republicans to own this confirmation, and I believe we have a development with Susan Wild right now. Yamiche, I'll send it back to you.
Okay, let's listen to Susan Wild.
To my attention that, in fact, we had agreed that we were not going to discuss what had transpired at the meeting, but it has come to my attention that the chairman has since betrayed the process by disclosing our deliberations within moments after walking out of the committee. And he has implied that there was an agreement of the committee not to disclose the report. That is an untrue, to the extent that that suggests that the committee was in agreement or that we had a consensus on that, that is inaccurate. And I will say that a vote was taken. As many of you know, this committee is evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, 5 Dems, 5 Republicans, which means that in order to affirmatively move something forward, somebody has to cross party lines and vote with the other side, which happens a lot, by the way, and we often vote unanimously. That did not happen in today's vote, and I do not want the American public or anyone else to think that Mr. Gaetz's characterization of what transpired today would be some sort of indication that the committee had unanimity or consensus on this issue, not to release the report. That would be an inaccurate portrayal, and nobody should take that from what they have heard so far. There was no consensus on this issue. We did agree that we would reconvene as a committee on December 5th to further consider this matter. And this statement that I have just made is on behalf of all of the Democratic members of the Ethics Committee. Thank you very much.
Democrats vote yes. Did all the Democrats vote too?
So that was Representative Susan Wild talking about the House Ethics Committee. Ryan, I want to come back to you. I'm a little concerned about whether or not what she was saying was accurate, because it sounded like the committee chairman was saying that there hadn't been a decision. She's saying that maybe he violated some sort of agreement there, and then was suggesting that there actually was an agreement not to release it. What do you know?
So, first of all, the first point she is making was that the committee had made an agreement that when they left the room, they weren't going to talk at all about their deliberations. That was the first part that she felt that Chairman Gaetz violated, because Chairman Gaetz did talk to reporters as he was leaving. And I think the particular part of what Gaetz said that she's making abundantly clear and making sure that people don't interpret incorrectly was that Gaetz said that there was no agreement as it relates to releasing the report. And she did not want to give the impression that there was a unanimous vote not to release the report. Now, Gaetz is not incorrect in saying that there was no agreement to release the report, because if you read between the lines here, it seems pretty clear, especially what she said given at the top of her remarks about the fact that there are equal parts Republican and Democrat. It sounds like there were 5 Republican votes not to release the report, 5 Democratic votes to release the report. Therefore, there was no agreement to release the report. So both of them are correct in their interpretation of this. What I think Wild is making very clear here is that this was not unanimous agreement to keep the reports under wraps. And I think the other point that is important, which Gaetz also alluded to, was that there would be a continuing conversation about how to handle this material, and that they would meet again after Thanksgiving on December 5th.
That's right. The committee chairman said we have regularly scheduled meetings between now and the end of the year. So this continues on. Thank you so much, Ryan Nobles from Capitol Hill. And Vaughn, I want to now bring you in. Take us inside this push to get Matt Gaetz confirmed as Attorney General, especially today while he's on Capitol Hill with J.D. Vance. How much more do we know about the sort of fight mode or maybe celebratory mode that the Trump transition team is in?
Right. Well, this is multi-pronged. Number one, the vice president-to-be, J.D. Vance, walking alongside up on Capitol Hill, shepherding him around to Senate offices to try to get him to those 51 votes. But then you also have Donald Trump, who has made phone calls directly from his Mar-a-Lago estate. We also had Donald Trump yesterday travel to Texas for the Elon Musk SpaceX launch, joined by Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Bill Hagerty. So for the Trump operation here, this was a decision made to put Matt Gaetz forward, one in which they knew all too well that there would be controversy and difficulty in getting to the 51 votes. Stephen Miller, who is a close Donald Trump aide, deputy chief of staff to be inside of this next White House, was on Fox with Sean Hannity last night and was asked whether Donald Trump would seek recess appointments in the scenario that there is a holdup among senators in confirming any of his nominees. And he directly answered, yes, of course, this is going to call into question the constitutional grounds which Donald Trump could try to adjourn the Congress come January of 2025. But I think if you look at Donald Trump's social media post just from a bit ago this afternoon, I think it's very representative of where Donald Trump mindset is when it comes to Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth and others like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. If you take a look, this social media post from Donald Trump, writing, quote, "This is what the radical left lunatics do to people. They dirty them up, they destroy them, and then they spit them out. They are trying that right now with some great American patriots who are only trying to fix the mess. What the Democrats have made of our country, we will win MAGA."
It's interesting that you point that out. I wonder if you could, in some ways, talk about the mindset of Trump a little bit more, especially when it comes to whether or not he's worried at all that Matt Gaetz might not be confirmed, because we are hearing, at least privately from some Senate Republicans, that they don't see this path forward.
Right. It's a good question, Yamiche, but I think that the body of evidence of Donald Trump and his history is, I think, the most representative of his fight and ultimately you win mentality, and that especially coming off of not only a defamation case, but one in which he was found to have sexually abused E. Jean Carroll, Donald Trump didn't back down, didn't stop denying the underlying facts and evidence and the claims made by E. Jean Carroll and individuals close to her in his own case in 2023 and 2024. Instead, he largely even campaigned on it and made the case that he was being unfairly attacked. And so we have seen here with Matt Gaetz him continue to stand by his side. But this goes back to 2017. We saw him do this with Roy Moore, who was credibly accused by multiple women of sexual misconduct towards teenagers years ago. We saw him do it with Charles Herbster, who is a Nebraska gubernatorial candidate in 2022, who had 7 women come forward with allegations of sexual misconduct against him. He went and campaigned for him in 2022. So for Donald Trump, this is another chapter of perhaps would it be uncomfortable defense for most people, but for Donald Trump, he has not seemed to have any idea of stepping away from individuals like this.
Yeah, and he's, of course, been pushing back against his own allegations and people saying that he's done things that were untoward. So thank you so much, Vaughn Hillyard from West Palm Beach. Chuck, of course, you talked about this in your column, the political capital that President-elect Trump is using up, or maybe using up, when it comes to Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth. What do you make of that? Does he have enough capital, political capital, to pull this through? Is it worth it in his mind?
Look, in his mind, I think he thinks he's invincible. Right, look what he has been able to get away with, right, throughout his entire political career. If you look at the last 10 years, is his political career. If he has said, I'm untouchable, I'm invincible, and he has that feeling, I don't think we should sit here. I mean, he now is representative of what he said famously 9 years ago. I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and my approval rating wouldn't go down. So with certain parts of the base, I think he does feel that invincible. The problem is the reality of how politics works. And he's going to expend, when you have, he's acting like he has a mandate. He won an election, but he didn't get a mandate. In fact, there are a lot of Democratic senators that got reelected in states that Donald Trump carried, which to me is like in direct contrast of a mandate. It's almost as, you can interpret that as the voters are saying, we want you there, but we don't trust your entire party. Yeah. Right? You can interpret that any way you want. Now, the irony is that the reason these Democratic senators are returning is his own voters showed up, voted for him, and left. Yeah. Because they don't care about the Republican Party. They cared about Trump. But Trump's going to expend all this capital browbeating these guys. Right now, they have no choice but to support him on these controversial picks. Most of them. I think one of them goes away. Probably Hegseth, because I think Gaetz he sees as sort of family, and he's going to fight. Hey, now, Gaetz may not get confirmed. I don't think Hegseth even makes it that far. I think he's one, because I just don't think there's the same personal connection. But he's going to burn up all this political capital. And then, Yamiche, he's about to go do what Joe Biden did for a year and a half. Negotiate one big fat bill with his own party with incredibly narrow majorities, particularly in the House. Yeah. Oh, by the way, he's got to make sure government's funded in mid-March. He is the first president that was able to successfully shut down the government while his own party controlled both the House and the Senate. So you can't rule anything out here. So he's got all these favors early on he's calling in. And you and I both know, eventually the public wears down. Yeah. And how is he? So he's using up capital now before he's ever taken the oath? Look, it's not the way to have a successful presidency and a successful agenda. It is a way if he just wants to seek revenge and burn the place down. Yeah. Well, I want to read part of your column because I think it's so important to sort of talk about this. You say, here's the political problem for Trump that he's creating for himself. He's taking full ownership of the entire bureaucracy now. This time, he has to deliver, and his ability to deliver depends on whether he can put together a stable set of political actors to not only do his bidding, but also somehow deliver on his promises to a whole new group of voters who are trying out Trumpism for the very first time. So if you think about that, if voters picked someone to sort of be a chaos and change candidate, does it matter sort of if he's focused on all of these things? But Denise, what I think we get wrong, and it's the same mistake the Biden folks made, is that they think the person who was a 51-49 voter and the person that was a 90-10 voter, meaning there was no way, of course they're voting for that party, that's what they always do, versus the one that's like, I don't know, but I'll try this out. Donald Trump won because of the margin of the I don't know, I'm going to try this out. I certainly didn't like what the Biden and Harris folks. So I do think there's a core part of his base that wants to burn it down. They want to get rid of the deep state. They want whatever that means. And it's sort of an imagined mythical thing, but everybody has their own definition of it. And they want to create a new bureaucracy that they control, right? I don't think the end of the day, the American people are always been a little libertarian, meaning when one party thinks, they doesn't want any party telling them how to live their lives, doesn't want any party telling them these things. So I question whether this is going to have staying power, just because nobody is immune from political sort of what you would call it, sort of I'm losing this word here, but essentially gravity, political gravity. Thank you, Melissa Frankel, in my ear. And no one's immune to it, neither Donald Trump. The first term, he could excuse his inability to get anything done, and he really didn't do anything other than a tax cut and warp speed. He could say, oh, it was Mitch McConnell's fault, or it was Fauci's fault, or it was all these other people that I didn't really want. This time, everybody's his. So when the government messes up, he can't blame somebody else. Democrats don't control the House. The Republicans do, by 2 votes. And that's now his burden. I don't think he fully appreciates that now every mistake government makes, there's no deep state to blame. He is the deep state. Bobby Kennedy's the deep state. Tulsi Gabbard's the deep state. They control it now.
I wanted to talk to you more about this because I also have the question of what are the consequences, because he's going to be a lame duck, but I have to go because we are, of course, having to move on.
I know, I talked too much. Took too long coming up with gravity.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.